Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our discussions, our discoveries, and our explorations with respect to the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2023. And that brings us to a release which has been designated by Criterion at spy number 1179. This is a Blu-ray release of a film which is described as being from the year 1968. And the name of the filmmaker is Peter Bogdanovich. And the name of the work is Targets. This is the work from the year 1968, the chilling, eerie, and very effective work from the filmmaker-artist Peter Bogdanovich. And we have this work directed by Peter Bogdanovich and written by Peter Bogdanovich with story by Polly Platt and Peter Bogdanovich, and also other interesting names of note among the really great crew. We have people like Roger Corman, and also with respect to the photography, director of photography, Laszlo Kovacs, and also, for example, Verna Fields is sound editor, and others, and so production designer to Polly Platt. And with regard to its very interesting cast, a really great cast, we have people like Tim O'Kelly and Nancy Sue and Peter Bogdanovich and Boris Karloff. Byron Orlock, and others in this, as I say, very effective, chilling work. It's sometimes been described as almost like a horror film, but I'll get to that description when we get to a discussion of some of the supplements a little bit later in this video. And I'm, of course, referring to this work, which is Targets. And my goodness, what to say when trying to describe the plot or story structure of this very memorable and, as I say, scary and eerie work, Targets? Well, I think maybe my use of adjectives can also be spread out a little bit more in the sense that this film could be described as perhaps having a double structure, or maybe two main storylines that are, in a sense, parallel or fused together in this way that sets up in what could be described as a type of intersection, or maybe another way to put it, a type of collision course of sorts. Because on the one hand, we have the story of Byron Orlock, the Boris Karloff character, who is an acknowledged film star, but perhaps he is in maybe the later stages or the twilight of his career, and so maybe his fame and his cinema renown, he himself acknowledges, might be sort of old hat in a manner of speaking. Because of sort of quote-unquote modern sensibilities in genre and horror cinema, although he is still acknowledged as a type of horror icon of classic horror cinema, classic genre cinema. And that type of horror beat, or that type of classic genre cinema spirit, is also finding wonderful parallels with the way in which Roger Corman is enwrapped or interwoven in terms of the financing of the film, but also in terms of the content of the film itself, with Boris Karloff serving as this type of mirror image of himself, while also acknowledging that he is playing a character. And I think it's a very interesting and very poignant display, too, because the character of Orlock, the Boris Karloff character, is very self-deprecating, very modest, has this type of sly wit about him, also very cultured, very intelligent, much like a type of a gentleman air and spirit about him. Avuncular in terms of the relationships that he has with a number of the other participants, other characters in the film. Nancy Sui character, Peter Bogdanovich character, to name but a few. So he has this air of respect towards others. He also acknowledges that perhaps his popularity is on the wane, and this is due to, as I say, generational shifts. This is due to changing tastes, the tide of culture turning one way against the other. But reminders of this sort of cinematic legacy that Orlok, a la Boris Karloff, and via Roger Corman, etc., have provided over the years is given, I think, great prominence in a lot of the cinematic quotes that are given. I think a fresh vividness and I think a loving homage tribute, not least of which being the cinematic references to the work The Terror with Boris Karloff and Jack Nicholson and others. So this becomes a lovely through line with this aspect of the film when we have Boris Karloff and Peter Bogdanovich and the characters that they are playing, among others. And we see that there is this way in which cinema and movie making and the changing tides and opinions of studios and executives, etc., and the integrity of the artistic spirit and the clash between, quote unquote, the money people and the creative people, end quote. That might be giving the Boris Karloff character a certain sense of a type of acerbic wit, a type of cynicism, also a sense of a sort of maybe a fading popular star, as it were. But we know as viewers that we are still in the presence of cinematic royalty, in a manner of speaking, the great legend that is Boris Karloff. And this is really one of the great things about this part of the film. Namely, we have the story of Orlok, who is, as I mentioned, very avuncular, very well-mannered, and also very self-deprecating. There's also this great parallel in which we see characters portrayed by Karloff, portrayed by Peter Bogdanovich, but also we are reminded that they too are, and will continue to be part of the movie-making culture and industry. Because of reminders of who Peter Bogdanovich is, who Boris Karloff is, and also reminders of Roger Corman's influence, a la The Terror and others. So we understand that this is in many ways a movie about making movies, with people who are in front of the camera and behind the camera, people who are involved with making movies, either in a fictional way or a non-fictional way. So, quote unquote, art imitates life, end quote, or life imitates art, whichever the case may be. In this part of the film, I think it's played up in a way that is, again, showing the sort of the cynical side of the commercial filmmaking, and also doing it in a way that's winking at the audience, that's doing it in a playful way, that's also very respectful of the great legacy of Boris Karloff, and indeed of Roger Corman, and indeed of Peter Bogdanovich, as we see this film looking back on it now, some years after the initial release of the film in 1968. I think we can see and regard these scenes with a great loving tribute to the filmmakers, owners that are involved both in front of the camera and behind the camera. So in this way, I think this section of the film works quite well. And as I say, it has this idea of art imitates life, or life imitates art, in the sense of art and commerce and movie making. So that's one thing. Now, I use these phrases, art imitates life and life imitates art, because I also want to focus on the other main component, the other main component of this film, because I mentioned that one can describe this film as having two main plot components. The other main component is the aspect of the film that involves the character Bobby, who is portrayed by Tim O'Kelly. And he is this young man who is maybe in a married life or family life, or a life of domesticity, and a quote-unquote normal existence, end quote. And I again use these air quotes a lot, because we come to realize slowly and surely, or perhaps not even slowly, perhaps for those of us who are astute enough to observe this in the audience, perhaps almost immediately at the start of the film, we come to realize that his story is far from quote-unquote normal, end quote. And indeed, it has a very dark and eerie and sinister and quite dangerous turn. We see his, say, engagement and relationship with certain members of his family. And we begin to wonder whether this type of quote-unquote domestic complacency has a sincereness about it, or is there perhaps a hidden frustration or edge or, dare I say it, danger about him? And we also see these scenes combined with, aspects of his life involving firearms, and also involving sort of day-to-day routines and activities that, as I say, are day-to-day and routine, and involve, for example, activities such as going to the range and practicing shooting, etc., which is in and of itself, I think, can be regarded as a kind of daily routine in the lives of these characters. So there's nothing inherently, I think, sinister about that. But we compound those with aspects of what we can sense to be the inner, say, workings of this character. And the more we get a sense of this, and the more the film provides entry points into possibilities of who this character is, I think the more we as viewers begin to question the domestic complacency of the situation, and we begin to wonder, and we begin to get more and more on edge, until suddenly, or perhaps not so suddenly, and perhaps without warning, or perhaps not without warning, the plot turns and shifts in a very violent and very shocking manner. And this violent and shocking manner has to do with firearms. It has to do with mass shootings, and the way in which characters are dealing with this situation, and also how the other plot thread that I mentioned before, the Boris Karloff plot thread, how and in what capacity, and to whatever effect it may or may not engender, how that plot line also collides with the plot line of the Tim O'Kelly plot line as well. So therein lies, I think, the undercurrent of the sinister and dangerous and quite disturbing edge that is given, I think, real prominence and quite a full-bodied sense of cinematic expression in this aspect of the film Target. So in that way, I think this film is balancing. It's doing a balancing act that's really quite a remarkable thing indeed. It's giving us a sense of the almost the absurd and the comic, play within a play, art imitating life in terms of the Boris Karloff, Peter Bogdanovich plotline. And then it's also giving us this eerie, dark, eerily quiet, but suddenly explosive plotline involving the Tim O'Kelly character and the family life and the domesticity and the complacency, or perhaps the undercurrent of danger beneath the surface that is just bubbling, or that has the potential of bubbling to the surface, and perhaps in quite vivid and shocking details, exploding. So these two these two poles, these two seemingly maybe polar opposites, actually are balanced quite effectively, and it gives us, I think, a sense of being on edge and being off balance, off kilter as we are watching the film. We are thrust into one direction with one plot line, and suddenly we are thrust in another direction, another plot line, and we seem to be torn at the pieces, but then we realize that it converges in a way that's very clever and very surprising, and it leads to a type of resolution that will bring us to the end of the film. And my goodness, we are on edge, I think, every step of the way. Now, I mentioned that one can describe these two differing plot lines as diverging, or perhaps being very opposite to each other. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think it's also possible to look at them in maybe similar parallel overtones. I mentioned in terms of the Boris Karloff plot line that one can look at that as art imitating life, and that type of through line. Well, I think something very eerily, and quite disturbingly, quite eerie and disturbing, is also very possible with the Tim O'Kelly plotline, because it does have at the focus of it this idea of mass shootings, and this idea of the sudden bursts of violence that can erupt and that can really create a sense of horror and panic among the public at large. And so gun violence. And so this creates, I think, an very unnerving and perhaps an all too distressing reminder of, say, various, say, real life events, shall we say, And so, in a very, I think, shocking and horrifying way, yes, art imitates life. And art imitates life both in terms of the past, present, and, dare I say it, the future post 1968. And so, I think, regardless of the issue, the political issue of, say, gun rights, which I think is related, but I think separate from the way that this film handles this issue of gun violence. I think one can say that yes, the way it erupts, the way that the violence does erupt, is quite eerie indeed, and as I say, perhaps a very disturbing and quite a horrifying aspect of this is indeed much like the Boris Karloff storyline in terms of the creative processes and filmmaking. This storyline involving the Tim Kelly character, we also have in a very chilling way art imitating life. And so art imitating life in one strand and art imitating life in another strand. And those strands then collide in a way that creates a sense of closure, or does it? When you watch the film, you have to figure out for yourself whether you feel a sense of closure. Perhaps there are some unanswered questions that are even more chilling by the fact that they are indeed unanswered. So this is, I think, in a nutshell, the way in which Targets is a very, very well-balanced, perhaps balanced to the point of purposely being off balance. And that, I think, adds to the psychological effect on the viewer as the viewer is watching this. And it creates this draw, and it creates a sense of, I think, curiosity, because we are talking about, quote unquote, various aspects of late 60s culture. This idea of sort of the day-to-day living in sort of the domestic life, and how, say, certain aspects of, say, 1960s political events, assassinations, the Vietnam War, this might also have a certain undercurrent to the atmosphere and the way in which specific parts of the plot may or may not be affected in one way or another. So this is currently in the air when we're watching this film, Targets from '68. And also in that same way, this idea of cinema at the time and the creative processes at the time, as expressed by Boris Karloff's, say, waning popularity, the twilight of his career, versus, say, the up-and-comer Peter Bogdanovich character, in a certain manner of speaking, and how those, say, generational sensibilities collide in a way on the canvas of filmmaking and film within a film. So I think those varying degrees also shed light on the fact that from different directions they are also casting a sense of the atmosphere, the 1960s atmosphere. And indeed, one can say that there's a type of creative spirit that is expressed by the Boris Karloff and Peter Bogdanovich line. I think there's a sense of homage to a cinematic past, and also a type of almost independent American filmmaking independent spirit that film component displays, which I think is really impressive and very much part of the times, where as the other aspect of the film is also perhaps quite chillingly and perhaps disturbingly also in many ways as part of the times, again, as we are reminded of the social and political climate of the era. So that is, I think, in a nutshell, what we can say about Targets. It is I think, a deeply effective work, and I'm also quite stunned as to how effective it is, even watching it in 2023, for reasons that I tried to allude to earlier in the discussion. Wow, what a startling work this is, and I'm so glad Criterion Collection has decided to release this film in its physical media catalog. This is the work from 1968. It is Targets. The Criterion Collection has released this film, Targets, into its physical media catalog, and it is designated spine number 1179. And what I have here is the single disc Blu-ray. Let me just open it up here just to give you a sense of what it looks like inside, utilizing this, I think, very reliable plastic casing, and the single disc goes on this side. On this side of the interior, we would have the compartment that would house the booklet, the staple booklet, and I smile when I say that. We'll talk a little bit more about the staple booklet, which is great, by the way. And so this is purported to be based on, this Blu-ray is purported to be based on the new 4K digital master, supervised by director Peter Bogdanovich, with uncompressed monaural soundtrack. And so, with a little bit more detail shown in the one of the pages on page 31 specifically of the booklet, let me quote, about the master. Targets is presented in its original aspect ratio of 1.85 to 1. This new 4K digital master was created from the 35mm original camera negative, which was scanned in 4K 16-bit on a laser graphics director film scanner. The original monaural soundtrack was remastered from the 35mm magnetic track. Transfer supervisors Peter Bogdanovich, Lee Klein, etc. So I have never had the great privilege of being able to watch this in the theater. So once again, my experience with various versions and presentations of this is, I admit, very, very limited. But with that being, I have seen the film a number of times, but I have no command over the presentation detail. So which presentation, quote unquote, is better than or more faithful than others. Again, I can't comment with any degree of confidence in that department whatsoever. But speaking from my own, once again, subjective experience, which I apologize for my lack of expertise over the technical details of presentation aspects, etc. But based on my subjective experience, this is a film that I think, for me anyway, from a psychological gut feeling that I have when I watch this film, I need that sense of an aged quality, and I mean that very, very positively. I don't need it to look pristine and new and crisp. And what I like about this, very much, what I love about this presentation is that it feels, the colors are, they pop out a little bit versus the versions that I've accustomed to when I've seen this film before. They pop out a little bit more, but they still feel, and I mean this again very positively, they feel dated. And I like that feeling of datedness because it reminds me of the era, the late 1960s, and that type of rough quality to the almost, I don't want to, is it maybe graininess? I don't know if graininess is the right word, but I love that. I love that. I love it's not pristine, clean a transfer. It's a transfer that has certain colors that pop out, but it is faithful. It has a sense of fidelity to the late 60s era. And this is very important for me too, I think, because it also enables me as a viewer to be reminded of the fact that this is a film about the present time, the late 1960s, and the social political climate that could be at stake when we are talking about how certain plot points turn and how certain character arcs develop. Also, it's a film that is about aged quality. It's about the aged films that are being referred to, specifically in the context of Boris Karloff's character. The films within the film, looking back on the past, looking back on a time that is not the present. And so that type of regarding of the past in this interesting, almost maybe paradoxical way, regarding of the past using a lens that is shooting the present. That present being, of course, 1968, which is right now, upon viewing it now, many years later in 2023, is now the past. And so this idea of looking at something that has almost a type of nuanced, nostalgic inherent nature to the look, I really appreciate very much, and I get a sense of that. So I like the quote-unquote, I mean, for lack of a better phrase, imperfections in the way it looks and the type of almost roughness in the way it looks. That to me works wonders. And I love how the transfer seems to be able to preserve those and yet augment aspects of, say, a color palette in a way that is very pleasing to the eye, at least to my eyes anyway. Very, very pleasing indeed. The way that looks and indeed the way that sounded provided for me a very rewarding experience. And as I say, it's an interesting thing about this idea of transfer, the art of the transfer, the art of the restoration. At what point, again, I'm not speaking in any way on the basis of any degree of expertise in this area by any stretch of the imagination, but I can only imagine from my very limited exposure to this that I can only imagine that one of the key dilemmas is to what point does one apply a restoration process that, say, cleans up the image versus to what degree is the restoration technique applied in order to preserve the quote-unquote rustiness or the roughness of the quote-unquote original image. What is the push and pull between these two seemingly contradictory approaches? And what is the ultimate answer at the end of the day? Well, I think it depends on the particular restoration that we're talking about here. But I would get a sense that for me anyway, this presentation has a sense of fidelity to it, or I can assume that it has a sense of fidelity to it based on, again, my own psychological reaction to watching it through this Criterion release, which, again, I think is very consistent with how I tend to read this film as this type of film about generations, about aging, as well as a film that is looking at the present and then also in a timely, aged manner, contextualizing it in 1968 and reminding us of that contextualized aspect through the restoration or presentation, while at the same time perhaps creating in our own minds the possibility of bridging the gap. So that's my very long-winded way of saying I really enjoy this presentation that's presented here for the basis of this Criterion release. And let us continue on with our discussion of this great release from Criterion by speaking about the supplements that can be found connected with or included with this really great Blu-ray release. And so, as we know, we can go into the submenu of the Blu-ray. And, well, before we actually get to the submenu, we should talk about the commentary track, which is part of the extras here. And it's a great commentary track carried over from 2003. And this is a commentary track with Peter Bogdanovich. And Peter Bogdanovich in general is one of the great, spokespeople when it comes to speaking about the history of film and speaking about the history of, filmmakers such as Orson Welles or Alfred Hitchcock, etc. And the same is true for when he is speaking about his own work, such as Targets. So here you are in for a real treat if you haven't heard this commentary track already. He speaks here about his time with Roger Corman and Roger Corman's influence and the sort of genesis behind the reason why certain, requirements were made that ended up being Targets and the film Targets that we know today. The involvement with Boris Karloff and how it needed to be the involvement of Boris Karloff and Boris Karloff being available for a certain number of shooting days. And then also the interweaving or the involvement of a currently existing film, The Terror, and other requirements. And should such requirements be satisfied, then Peter Bogdanovich was essentially free to craft a film around such, requirements. And oh gosh, does he ever do so. And here he speaks a little bit about working with Boris Karloff and how Boris Karloff was really a gentleman on set. Well-read, avuncular, and so it was a real pleasure working with him. So, and he also mentions too how there's a little bit of maybe a physical ailment that is that's very slightly visible in some of the scenes, but overall, Boris Karloff maintains a kind of a real cinematic, aura and decorum. That is in keeping with the great legacy and history that he brings to the table. So Peter Bogdanovich speaks in very glowing terms about working with Boris Karloff here, and that's a really wonderful thing to see. And also he speaks too about the role of Tim O'Kelly, and it's a very key role, and it's a role that it has a sort of unnerving quality. And also working with Laszlo Kovacs. I forgot to mention, the director of photography, Laszlo Kovacs, and how this has, there are some indications here, and also in other discussions that are included in the supplements for this released Targets, about working with the famous director of photography during the very early stages of his career as well, such as also the early stages of the career of Peter Bogdanovich. So it's a very interesting thing. Also, Peter Bogdanovich here mentions the great influence and the assistance and support that was provided by none other than Samuel Fuller in terms of a type of rewrite or reworking of the story. And Samuel Fuller insisted on getting no credit as a rewriter or co-writer. But Peter Bogdanovich never forgot the great debt that he owed to this master filmmaker and teacher and friend and mentor to him. So kudos to Samuel Fuller for being able to pull these threads together, according to Peter Bogdanovich. So it's a really great thing. We're also working with some of the other actors on the shoot, such as Nancy Sui, and working because she has a very kind of key critical role in terms of her character's relationship with Boris Karloff's character and also Peter Bogdanovich's character and the like. And so it has one of the sources of, say, the drama or tension of that particular part. And it also adds a type of, I think, it creates I think, a very interesting dynamic in terms of the interweaving of the personal and the professional, shall we say. So it's interesting to hear comments about that from Peter Bogdanovich. And then also issues about or aspects of the editing, etc., and the use of sets and the decor, the work of Polly Platt. Of course, Polly Platt was a great, very, very important partner and collaborator, Peter Bogdanovich, and also so key in terms of production designer and key aspects of the story as well, and the genesis of the story. Also working with the idea of source sound, sort of the music or soundtrack choices that were made in terms of the creation of this and the like. And also the real life sort of inspiration, or shall I say, that maybe inspiration is not the right word, but the real life, very frightening story, the real incident, Charles Whitman incident, and how this is said to be one of the key sources of the creation of the story targets, or one of the creation of the story targets. Also coming into mind aspects of the Vietnam War and also aspects of the 1960s socio-political upheaval, and also involved its share of very frightening and very sudden and horrific events of political assassination. So I think these and other elements of the discussion, I think, are very apropos and very, very insightful. And it's so great to hear this from Peter Bogdanovich. So if you haven't listened to this commentary track, please do so. You are in for a treat. This is the commentary track with Peter Bogdanovich from 2003. That's included as part of this package. And then continuing on with the discussion of the supplements that are included with this great release from Criterion, we have an interview discussion from 2023 with none other than Richard Linklater. And this is approximately 26 minutes. And this is really great because Richard Linklater, as a filmmaker and artist, he is speaking in terms of a great deal of respect and reverence and a real dedication to the art and craft of Peter Bogdanovich in terms of Peter. He reminds us, too, of Peter Bogdanovich's sort of multi-talents. Peter Bogdanovich is not only a filmmaker, Peter Bogdanovich also has a career as an actor, and also Peter Bogdanovich has a career as a type of historian and a film critic historian. And so that means that he has done a lot of work, as I mentioned, in terms of his work of filmmakers, in particular filmmakers from 20th century American cinema, or early to mid 20th century American cinema, coming to mind, for example, as I mentioned, Orson Welles, Alfred Hitchcock, and others. And also Peter Bogdanovich has a type of experience throwing his hat into the ring in terms of acting as well. And that is coming to the fore, does it not, when we think about the film targets, because Peter Bogdanovich does appear in a kind of critical role. And his acting chops are on display, and I think he does a really great job. And then Richard Linklater. So this is Richard Linklater's way of, I think, telling us about how, in many ways, a type of Renaissance artist Peter Bogdanovich is. And he has so much respect for him for that and for other reasons. And then also Richard Linklater reminds us, too, of the climate of the times in which this film was made. And also the film seems to be reflecting the 60s. And we mentioned, too, Charles Whitman, and we mentioned, too, the idea of violence and the idea, too, about how this is not just contextual in terms of a specific time period, but it also perhaps quite chillingly and unfortunately seems to have certain echoes in mass shooting incidents even in sort of modern day unfortunately. And so Richard Linklater mentions, for example, Aurora, and how this seemed to really, really affect Peter Bogdanovich in a very deep way. So in other words, it's very topical. That's what Richard Linklater says, and that's what makes it a really great early film. Richard Linklater also reminds us too of the great other great aspects of Peter Bogdanovich's career, such as The Last Picture Show, and he says that perhaps in terms of a critical assessment, it's very it's not unusual for people to be drawn immediately to say the early successes of Peter Bogdanovich in The Last Picture Show. But here Richard Linklater makes the case that indeed the film that was made prior to that being Targets, is, I think, an equal contender for being a great early film, a great first feature film. And indeed, he says, too, that the times are coming around, and so people are really beginning to take notice, I think, once again, of the film Targets as being a really crucial film in the context of the body of work of Bogdanovich, as well as a real raw and edgy 60s film. And I think that makes the case for it to be a really great classic film indeed. So for those and other reasons, I think here Richard Linklater sings the praises of Bogdanovich, and sings the praises, I think, very, very well and very artfully with respect to this work, Targets. So this is the discussion with Linklater about Peter Bogdanovich and Targets, approximately 26 minutes. And that's not all, because then we have an introduction by Peter Bogdanovich, and this is also described as being from 2003, and it's approximately 13 minutes. So here we get a more discussion from Peter Bogdanovich as a type of continuation or a nice supplement to the other supplement being the commentary track. And here he speaks a little bit more about things that he touched upon in the commentary track, such as working with Roger Corman, Wild Angels, working with Polly Platt, the inspiration, the chilling inspiration provided by the incident of Charles Whitman, working with Sam Fuller, working with Boris Karloff, and the socio-political upheaval, the real-time horrific incidents involving Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, etc., and also coming back to a discussion of the film. This idea of trying to get it off the ground, Paramount Studios, etc., etc. So this is another great discussion from Peter Bogdanovich, which is again a nice complement to the comments that he made in the commentary track as well. So please check this out if you can. It's the introduction by Peter Bogdanovich from 2003, approximately 13 minutes. And then that's not all, because then we have an audio excerpt of a talk that was given by a kind of question and answer session or discussion, an open discussion, given by Polly Platt at the AFI. And this is described as being from 1983. And it's an audio excerpt, but it's 30 minutes. And it's really fantastic, because Polly Platt is probably one of, if not the key sort of partner and collaborator with Peter Bogdanovich during this stage of his career, including working on this film Targets. So she is also talking about the genesis of writing this work, and also her work on the film, her collaboration with Bogdanovich, production design aspects, writing aspects as well. She talks about Women of Venus, and then also talking about working and being a type of life partner with Bogdanovich at the time. And the Nouvelle Vague, the French New Wave, was something that was very influential on the two of them, Truffaut in particular. And so you take these aspects of the Nouvelle Vague on the one hand, and also aspects of real life, as again, Charles Whitman incident and Vietnam, and the social political upheaval, this idea of violence, the depiction of violence, and how this is portrayed, and how this can be portrayed, and what ended up being portrayed in the story that became Targets, and sort of a collaboration between Polly Platt and Peter Bogdanovich. So this is really fascinating stuff. And she also speaks to about the depiction of violence and how this is done, and whether their choices were appropriate or not. Also, she works as the production designer, so there's this idea too about how the sets were struck down and reused in a very economical way, And there's some details too about the set decor, which may or may not provide some clues as to the maybe motives of some of our key characters. Again, it's very oblique, and so they aren't directly provided, but there are these subtle clues that I think are embedded within the actual production design itself, the walls and the pictures, etc. Again, may provide some clues as to why things happen the way they do. So that's a great thing from Polyplat as well. And also working with Boris Karloff again. It was mentioned before, and it's mentioned here, the real avuncular gentleman and the very self-effacing great legend that is Boris Karloff, and then other aspects of this film. So Polyplat is a key collaborator and partner when it comes to this period of filmmaking. Roger Corman, Peter Bogdanovich, and Targets. And so her comments here are so essential and insightful. So it's really great to have those. So this is the excerpts from the discussion from Polyplat, described as being from 1983, and it's approximately 30 minutes. It's really, really great, the audio excerpts. And then the supplements are rounded out with a trailer. So I think, again, one might think that in terms of quantity, it might have been interesting to get more supplements, say, maybe more discussion of, say, the period of Roger Corman era, the early body of work of Bogdanovich, something like that, Polyplat, etc. That would have been really interesting. But I think what we get here is absolutely splendid. Really splendid. Maybe the majority of it is stuff that we've seen elsewhere that has been carried over from other elements, but that's okay. That's really okay, especially when it comes to commentary track. I'm a big fan of commentary tracks, so it's great to get a commentary track, especially one from Bogdanovich. And I'm just a big fan of his, just hearing him talk. And hearing him talk about his own films or the films of other great filmmakers, it's just a real delight. So to have that in terms of the introduction that he gives, the 13-minute or so introduction, and then also the commentary track, the feature-length commentary track, great, as well as Polyplat's wonderful, insightful anecdotes and discussions. And then, of course, the sort of interview of admiration from the great Richard Linklater himself. So, and then the trailer. So this is the discussion of the supplements that can be found with Targets. And let us conclude our discussion. Oh, there we go. Okay. Let us conclude our discussion with just comments about the cover art design and also some aspects of the booklet as well. It's really great. It's a staple booklet. It's really wonderful. But before we get to that, let's just look at this really, I think, quite effective, and you mean this in a positive way. It evokes a type of creepiness of the aspect, and also the double bill aspect of the structure of the plot. Targets. I really like this cover art design. The use of the target itself and the like, and the sort of collage motif, I think, is befitting. And this motif is also included on the back. I really love this design. It has a nice chilling sort of minimalistic quality to it, and also that quality is carried over into the use of the circle and the target motif as well. Very, very frightening stuff. So I should mention here that art directors Eric Skillman, Sarah Habibi, designer Sister Hyde, our dear friend Sister Hyde. It's really, really great stuff. Again, very evocative of the kind of chilling and creepy aspect. And also the type of a cinematic collage motif, which I think is really cool indeed. And I love the font use. So this is the packaging design. And again, using the plastic casing, and I always love it when the disc itself gets a little bit of this decoration, and also the interior there in terms of the inner casing. So very cool indeed. And on the other side of the interior compartment would go the staple booklet. Ta-da! Here we have a staple booklet, and bravo to Criterion for including the staple booklet. I love this. I really, really love this because it provides a lot of robust pages and writings. And so here we have a booklet that does not disappoint. We have casting credits. We also have the carryover of the art motif. And then also we have a number of writings. First, American Sniper by Adam Nayman. And then You Have to Know the History of What Came Before, an interview with Peter Bogdanovich. And so these two writings are excellent. These two writings are really quite excellent. The Bogdanovich interview which is the second of the two writings. I think it's also a great supplement and adds great insight into what we have already heard in terms of the commentary track and the introduction that's found is found in the supplemental menus. But also, it goes into a lot of great anecdotal information and detail. So. Really well done for being able to do this. It's great. And then the first of the writings, the essay, the Adam Nayman essay, American Sniper. Oh my goodness. This is, again, a lovely, wide in scope, far-reaching sort of assessment of the work, assessment of Peter Bogdanovich's career, and the way it has a type of fixture in the history and space and time of the 1960s in this very, I think, rugged and quite confident and very effective way. And so this is a brilliant essay, absolutely brilliant. American Sniper. So as with other essays, please, 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 my strong recommendation is to watch the film first, and then you can go ahead and read the writings that are included in this great booklet. Oh, it's so great. This is absolutely fantastic. I read through this a number of times, so fantastic. Truly, truly fantastic indeed. And I should also point out that it's a special thanks in the middle here. On page 31, it says, this release is dedicated to the memory of Peter Bogdanovich. Thanks for all your contributions to the world of cinema. And if that isn't a real fitting way to sort of put a nice bookmark in this part of the great Criterion release, I don't know what is. That's a really lovely touch. So, indeed, what a great, great booklet for a great release from the Criterion collection. Oh my goodness! And shout out to our dear friend of the channel, Sister Hyde. So, well done indeed. This is Targets from Criterion, the Blu-ray. Wow, wow, wow. Wow, wow, wow for the Criterion release, and wow, wow, wow for the film itself. And if you haven't seen it, oh my goodness, it's scary. You know, sometimes Peter Bogdanovich describes it as a horror film, and other times he doesn't describe it as a horror film. There's some parts of the commentary track where I think he resists the label of it being a horror film, but then in other parts he actually acknowledges its horror film elements. And I think that type of push and pull, that type of maybe resistance for the label, but then also the acceptance, I think is very apropos, because it's a reflection of the fact that this can be many things at once. Horrific and funny, endearing and chilling, which is, I think, a great type of, it has a sense of a type of polarizing nature I think is very apropos of the climate and atmosphere that it's trying to portray. And then also the echoes that we can feel to this very day, as well as also being a great, great example, again, in the words of Richard Linklater, of a great first film, of a great body of work from the filmmaker artist Peter Bogdanovich. It is this film, which is Targets. All right, my dear friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great, great movies. And so until the next video, my dear, dear friends, stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.